Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning into the Liberty Report. Today is the day we do Mythbusters. The co-host is Chris Rossini. He is also the editor of the LibertyReport.com. Chris, welcome to the program today.
Great to be with you, Dr. Paul. Good morning.
Do you have any myths that we should discuss?
Yes, we're going to tackle debt today, and the presidential candidate who calls himself the king of debt. It's very prophetic that someone who loves debt so much, as he says, wants to be the president of a country that's virtually bankrupt. And he knows that it's a bad situation, but he also touts his negotiating skills, and he says, well, we just may have to renegotiate the debt or discount the debt. However, Dr. Paul, that's already common practice. They discount the debt every single day without renegotiating. The creditors are already, they get stiffed every day. So please talk about how it's already common policy to discount the U.S. national debt.
Well, this is certainly the case. The decrease in the real debt occurs constantly because we constantly devalue our currency. And of course, then we resort to blaming everybody else for manipulating their currency. But our job in managing the worldwide currency, the reserve currency, gives us a lot of leverage. The average country can't get away with this, but we can. We can discount the debt by literally printing money. Not only is it automatic, but it's never enough. Our Federal Reserve and our government wants to discount faster by having more inflation. They're not satisfied with 1.8 or 2%, but even though we're quite convinced there's more than that. But they want a lot more, and when we do get a lot more, they're going to be unhappy with it. So they want to continue the discounting of the debt, the real debt. But Trump argues the case that he can compare this to what he has done in business, and he's not bashful about it. He says, well, he had these businesses, he ran up the debt, and they had to renegotiate with them. So if he was paying 6, 7, 8% maybe for some of those projects, and he wouldn't necessarily back off and borrow less, he'd borrow more, because then he said it was no big deal, to renegotiate, and he could make millions of dollars in a short period of time. Well, a country can't do that, for one thing. You can't renegotiate as if you're a private person doing this. Now, there are a few people left in the world today that think that bankruptcy is not an ethical thing to do, but it certainly is legal in this country to do it, and people have to resort to it. But there's a lot of people who don't do this. But to use this as a deliberate policy and think that you can translate that into a policy for the government, I think what he's thinking that he can do is the same thing, that if we have a lot of debt and we owe the Chinese, because we're going to make the Chinese pay, and we owe them $1.3 trillion, and the average interest rate might be 4%, then he's going to renegotiate and take those bonds in and say, okay, we're going to give you bonds and we're going to pay you 1%. Well, there's an ongoing process. New debt can be lower, but he can't renegotiate old debt. But I think that was knocked down rather quickly by just about every economist in the world to say that that is not going to happen. But Trump was very emphatic about not allowing interest rates to go up, because that would be a bigger problem. Of course, from our viewpoint, the government shouldn't be in the business of fixing interest rates. Interest rates should, be set by the market. And obviously, if we allowed the market to operate and the Fed couldn't buy debt and couldn't do QE, which is the process whereby they discount debt, if they couldn't do that, interest rates probably would go up. They would have to depend on savings, and there would be a lot of complaints about that, and a lot of people would suffer from the overextension. But to continue this, because it seems to be working and we have this edge with issuing the reserve currency of the world, isn't a reason to do it. It's not a good excuse. Matter of fact, all that does is extend even further the disconnect between real value and pretend value, and the malinvestment and the overinvestment. It continues to create these bubbles that even on the short run seem to be okay, because the process seems to be working for Wall Street fairly well. But we have two parts of our country right now. We have the lower middle class and the poor who are suffering and aren't benefiting, where the other half are. But see, this will come to an end. But the thought of discounting debt and renegotiating with countries, that will not work. Eventually, though, something will have to happen, and it's an ongoing process. So we're already in the business of discounting debt, and I think that'll continue for a while longer until some big economic or foreign policy event comes and just makes the announcement the ball game is over. And there are days when I keep thinking it's getting closer and closer to that event, which will not go unnoticed.
Yes, it's a shame that it must be a part of human nature that you have to wait for a catastrophe in order to change, that you don't head it off before that. But we're doing the best we can here. We're going to stick with Donald Trump. And another major error he made, he basically took all of monetary history and tossed it aside. The ability and the desire for governments to just print money at will is not anything new. This is not, the United States is not the first to do it. And the failure rate is a pure 100%. All of these experiments have always failed throughout history. So Donald Trump says that the U.S. will never, quote, never default because they could just print the money. Now, does supply and demand not apply to the dollar, Dr. Paul?
Well, obviously it does, but they don't want to admit this. And this is obviously a myth that you can solve this problem by just printing money, because that is defaulting. And it's a wicked default because it's sinister, and the victims are real victims, and they don't quite realize what's happening, and they usually demand more government spending and more debt, but the real victims are the ones who end up with the inflation. But there have been direct defaults in our history. I mean, deliberate defaults. Even in revolutionary time, our original government had to default on the continental dollar. And then in the Civil War, we defaulted on the gold standard, and people got stiffed, and they got greenbacks. But fortunately, back then, there was still respect for the gold standard, and they went back on the gold standard, but they went through this default. But then Roosevelt did it too. You know, it was a default when our government admitted we are broke, we don't have the gold, and we don't want people to have gold because of distortion. We took away the right of people to own gold. And in '71, we went on a default internationally because Americans no longer could claim gold, but foreigners could. So we were trying to maintain stability by guaranteeing that our dollar was good as gold at $35 an ounce, but we kept printing money. So we were defaulting all along. So when we do that, this is a literal default. And yet the default is the constant inflation of the money supply, which devalues the currency. And this is the way the bills will be paid. Governments generally do not default by not sending out the checks. Now, there's been hints and rumors that some of the policies might be where they will cut back on Social Security payments and pension funds. They're not going to do that. If all of a sudden somebody said, well, we're in big debt, we've overextended ourselves, the bank account is empty, so we're going to cut a literal nominal cut in Social Security benefits. That is not the way it's going to occur. That would cause a revolution overnight. So it has to be a more sinister. But the planners have been fooled into thinking that it will be automatic. Just, print the money and it's going to respond exactly as we want it to. It'll stimulate the economy, prices will go up, the value of the dollar goes down, and real debt will go down. Well, it works that way sometimes, but sometimes it takes a while longer. And our government now sets this goal at 2%, and they're annoyed. They would take 3, 4, 5. So it's a deliberate policy of our government to default. And they can get away with this more than other countries because we issue the reserve currency of the world. this has been a tremendous advantage to us, and yet we have people, individuals, who want to blame the other countries for it. We want to blame China for manipulating their currency and all these things. But when we can issue the currency that people will use and take, we can export our inflation. So the inflation, when the money goes out of the country, there's less money bidding up the prices and causing penalty on our people. So we send the money to China. It encourages our businesses to go to China, cheaper labor, and then we get the products back and they take our money. So we're inflating their system, which becomes very vulnerable. And then when the signs there are that it's not sustainable, then the natural forces of free markets come in and they say we have to have an adjustment. We have to go back to deflating the prices and trying to liquidate the debt and liquidating all the monetary inflation. So what do there? They lower their prices, so they export their deflation to the United States. We exported our inflation to them. They are exporting and we're importing their deflation because prices are actually going down. It makes it harder for our companies to compete. It's all a consequence of the nonsense, the greatest myth that has existed in monetary history ever has been the myth that fiat currency is a sound economic system. And they're playing games, they're playing with fire. It is so grossly distorted right now, and it's just amazing that it's being held together with a string. And one day that's going to change, and there will be a true devaluation, and there will be an absolute need for monetary reform, because the system we have today has never worked in the past, but it's bigger and worse than ever before, because the whole world is engulfed with this fiat system, and we are the managers of that. So it's going to be very hard for the monetary historians to say, well, it was all somebody else's fault. No, it was the managers of this currency. And we've had a free ride because we have been very rich. We still have a lot of wealth compared to others. We have a powerful military force. And this helps put emphasis on the monetary system. They tend to trust the money longer than they should because there is a subjectivity to trust and pricing. So this has been going on a long time. The average smaller country can't get away with this, and we have been able to do this, but it will come to an end, and there will be a default. Believe me, the default will be that everybody's going to get paid off and the money's not going to be worth much, and we are going to see many, many people suffer from this, and it will absolutely require monetary reform. Hopefully, we in this country could lead that reform, but right now we're leading the deform. We're leading it in the wrong direction because we are the principal culprit in destroying the monetary system because we issue the reserve currency of the world, and we have done a lousy job.
Yes. Next, Dr. Paul, you were on the major networks a few times this week, and I really enjoyed one of your appearances where you actually had the opportunity to talk about the myth of the two-party system, how both philosophically and in practice the Republicans and Democrats are interchangeable. One side wears red ties, the other side wears blue ties. That's about the only difference. And you also accurately pointed out, and this ruffled some feathers, that maybe it's not automatic that Hillary Clinton would be 10 times, 100 times worse than Donald Trump, even though that's a popular opinion. So please discuss this myth of the two parties, and I know you have a great chart to put up too.
Yes, and I think if people accept this myth that there's not a whole lot of difference, which many of us have followed for a long time, they also have to admit that the difference between the concerns about the election, the arguments on the election, and this is the biggest election in the world. If we get this guy or this person, one back and forth, it's going to make all the difference in the world in elections. Just think how long this particular election is going on, because they have no answers to the disaster that we're facing. It goes back and forth. It becomes personalized. But the real myth is that the election process is important, where they ignore the significance of monetary policy, tax policy, income tax, over-regulations, foreign policy, all the things that reflect what people think the role of government ought to be. That is not dealt with. It becomes personalized and ugly and never dealing with the subject. Now, I read something this morning that I thought was interesting. Yesterday there was a vote in the Senate on the water bill. And the president sent a bill over there, and the bill, the Republicans running the Senate increased the bill by $261 billion. And they said that they needed the money. And Heritage put out the press release, and this was a victory for the Republicans, because this year they want to pass every single appropriation bill, which is about 13 of them, and they never get them done. They always have an omnibus bill at the end of the year, but it's different. They're going to be organized. So they called this, Heritage called this a victory for the Republicans by being able to raise Obama's bill for energy and water by $260 billion. And that's where we are today. So this is why people shouldn't be too optimistic or concerned that there's going to be a big difference between the Republicans and Democrats. And I'd like to put up a chart that demonstrates this to a bit. On here, this shows how much federal outlays per capita in the last several decades, back to 1945. But take a look in the middle there on Reagan, and also under George W. Bush. That is where you see the most significant increase in the amount of spending per capita. And Obama, it's actually down. Who would have believed it? Who would have believed it was flat under Clinton? So it's just a myth, a total myth, that Republicans are conservatives and liberals are the big spenders. I think they're all the same, because because the Republicans admit they're not fiscal conservatives when it comes to foreign spending and foreign wars. Well, we have to save the country. That's why we have to be in the Middle East. We have to fight these wars. We have to do all these things. And the people say, yeah, this is important to have national defense. Of course it is, but to destroy our country financially and overemphasize some of our dangers, that's hardly a way to do it. But it is indeed a major myth to think that all of a sudden that there's a big difference between the two. The thing that they forget about is how government operates. It doesn't operate with a democracy of the Congress and how they vote. There's the special people in Congress, the people in leadership are always backed by and financed by those individuals we call the deep state, the shadow government. And they're the ones who may not operate as a monolith, but as a group. They are able to harness democracy, so to speak, where if there's enough money put on pressure, Republicans and Democrat leadership, they get what they want. The best example in that would be the military-industrial complex, but everything else is that way. The water program, everybody has to vote for that. The farm program, they get together, and it's not one party over the other, because the people who know how to lobby for power, there's a real contest there, but it's not a philosophic contest of fiscal conservatives and fiscal liberalism or peace versus war. It's over power, and it has over the individuals who want to pass out the largesse. That's where the contest is. So the real contest is outside of Washington, and the people have to decide what the role of government ought to be, and they have to wake up to the fact that this whole thing is not dependent on this election. This is a distraction. It's a distraction from the shadow government. It's a distraction from the deep state, where the real power is and where the determinations are made. And they sort of play on the democracy. Oh yeah, of course our founders hated democracy, because that means that if you can get these groups together and they become majority and they can dictate to the leadership, they call that democracy. But that is not what was intended. It was never intended that we have this monolithic government in Washington, D.C. with so much power that allowed us to print money and run up debt and have income taxes and have a welfare state. That was never intended. But the deep state, the special interests, are in charge of that. So this is why you have to realize that tinkering around with an election doesn't do very much. That's only going to count if we wake up the whole people. But who's going to wake them up? I mean, we have a lot of people graduating from college or college students right now. They sort of think, oh, well, maybe the answer is socialism. But I give them a pass because they probably weren't even taught what socialism was about if they go to the average college. That's why I think the big effort has to be education outside of the organized government schooling system that we have today. But I think the big myth here is that that the Republicans and Democrats actually are competitors, and yet they're working against us, against the people, equally so.
Yes. Finally, Dr. Paul, let's finish up by diving into the fantasy world and throwing in a few life jackets. Hopefully people will grab on. Just yesterday, we had a fantastic guest on the show. His name was Professor Andrew Bacevich, and I recommend everybody watch that interview because he pointed out and he spoke a little bit about American exceptionalism and this illusion that people live under, thinking that the U.S. government has this duty, this providential duty, to remake the world in its own image. I guess when you go overseas and kill 1 million Iraqis, you're doing the Lord's work. I can't follow the concept, but please, Dr. Paul, elaborate some more on this myth called American exceptionalism.
Well, this is a risky discussion because nobody wants to say that we aren't the greatest and we aren't the best and we aren't the most exceptional nation ever. But I think the best way to handle this is think about the American people, the culture of the American people, the goodness in many Americans. And in that sense, I think there's so many exceptional people, very generous people, people who respond to natural disasters and really want to help people, are willing to send money to different countries that need help. But that's not what we're talking about. American exceptionalism is Jacobinism. You know, it's today it's called neo-Jacobinism, where we are a great nation, we are a great government, and we can do no harm. But it started out very early because they talked about the manifest destiny of the United States. We were destined to do this, and it was early on that occurred, and it just massively expanded at the time of the Spanish-American War, when we spread our wings and went all the way to the Philippines and got involved after we took the continent. And that our government can do no wrong because the people are good, and therefore the government reflects the people, and it must be all well intended, and that's what the propaganda always says, that we're going for good reason. But this whole idea that all of a sudden we can return to that period of time when we were the exceptional good nation, we could do no wrong. I mean, we could go back and talk about many things. We have been a warring nation. The 20th century has been a disaster. If people think that the income tax was a great idea, or the Federal Reserve was a great idea in the 20th century, that's not exceptional. We go around the world taking over countries and telling them what you need is an income tax and what you need is a central bank. And what you need is a welfare safety net for everybody, and you need to be part of our army, and we'll tell you how to run your country. We're going to have elections like we have, but you have to elect the people we pick. If you don't, then we'll hire a dictator to overthrow you. So it goes on and on. But how could we be an exceptional country when we got involved in World War I? If anybody wants to find something that is very unexceptional, was the needlessness of getting into World War I, Woodrow Wilson making the world safe for democracy. What a disaster. And just look at what the consequence. World War II is just a continuation of World War I. Then we had the consequence of the Federal Reserve printing money to allow this to happen, the introduction of the welfare state, the introduction of accepting Keynesian economic interventionism. It goes on and on. It just was the total undermining the great things that were talked about at the founding of this country. You know, believe it or not, I'm an optimist about the progress of individual liberty, but I have to go all the way back to the Hammurabi Code and the Ten Commandments and the Great Charter. You know, those were, and our Declaration of Independence. But America did okay for a bit. But I'll tell you what, just looking to that last 150 years and what we have done overseas, we are exceptionally on the wrong track is what's happened. And so we have drifted a long way from improving and expanding on personal liberty. So everybody said, well, it's necessary because they're going to attack us. ISIS are coming. So therefore, we have to take away the rights of the people. We have to check everything that's going. You can't get on an airplane, and the government has to know everything that we do. We have no privacy left. They're destroying the value of the money. And then all the politicians are missing the whole point. All we have to do is argue over personalities and how you're going to spend more money and pretend the two parties are different. So I would say there's a lot to be said about the American people. And there's a lot to be said about historically over thousands of years that individuals have been educated to believe that liberty is a personal matter and it's not something granted to us by government, but it comes to us in a natural God-given way. When we understand that, and if we can promote that, we will be truly an exceptional nation. But we cannot be an exceptional nation with the policies that we have today, whether they're economic policy or foreign policy, because we are not on the right track, and the American people know it. Ask that famous question of the politician, are we on the right track or the wrong track? And most Americans say we're on the wrong track. But it's not hard to describe the right track. We know about where the right track is. We know what liberty is all about. But we have been undermined by the propaganda, by the distortions and the temptations and the government-run school system. But believe me, the opportunity is still there. And that is the reason why I think we can find that part of America which is exceptional, and not the part that is a political authoritarian exceptionalism that we think that we can promote like they did in the French Revolution, because then if you didn't accept the ideas of democracy and these good trends, you can be in big trouble, and that's about the way it is in this country. So I'd like to look more toward the favorable thing, because we can be an exceptional nation by setting a good standard, let other countries want to emulate us. That would be a much happier scenario for me. Chris, I want to thank you for being with us today as the co-host.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paul.
And I want to thank our audience for being with us as well. And please return to the Liberty Report soon.